Susan Wallace had traveled 2,000 miles on the strength of a lie, and she did not discover it until she was standing in the parlor of a man who smelled of pomade and cheap tobacco, watching his face go the color of old ash as he tried to explain why there was a daguerreotype of a dark-haired woman on his mantelpiece with the inscription, "To my beloved husband, Gerald, forever yours, Clara, Boston, 1882." The year was 1883, and the town of Harwick, Colorado, sat at the base of the Rocky Mountains like a stone someone had forgotten to kick aside. It had a general store, a saloon that doubled as a courthouse on certain desperate Tuesdays, a livery stable, a small white church that leaned slightly to the east as though listening for something, and a telegraph office where Gerald Hatch had composed his careful, flattering letters to Susan Wallace of Cincinnati, Ohio, describing himself as a widower of good standing and considerable property, who was lonely in a way that only a good woman could remedy. Susan had believed him. She was 24 years old, possessed of brown hair that curled at the temples no matter what she did to stop it, steady gray eyes that people sometimes found unsettling because they looked so directly at things, and a practical intelligence that had kept her employed as a seamstress and later as a bookkeeper for her uncle's dry goods shop since the age of 16. She was not naive. She had read his letters 3 times apiece, had asked questions by mail that she thought were pointed enough to reveal any dishonesty, and had consulted her aunt before making her decision. She had done everything right. And still she was standing in this parlor with the realization spreading through her chest like cold water, looking at Gerald Hatch, who was 41, shorter than his letters had implied, and wearing an expression of cornered guilt that she recognized instantly from years of watching her uncle try to explain away bad accounts. And she understood with absolute clarity that Clara of Boston was not dead. "She is my wife," Gerald said at last, because there was nothing else left to say. "She has been my wife for 14 years. We had a disagreement, a serious one. She stayed in Boston and I came west, and I believed that enough time had passed that it might be possible to deceive another woman into coming here to cook and clean and share your bed," Susan said. Her voice was very quiet and very even. She had learned long ago that a quiet voice frightened people more than shouting. Gerald winced. "I did not intend to deceive you. I genuinely, Mr. Hatch," she said. "I have been on a train for 11 days. I have slept sitting up and eaten cold biscuits and been stared at by strangers from Missouri to Colorado. I arrived at your station this morning with 1 trunk, $32, and the reasonable expectation that I was about to begin my life. I would like you to tell me where I can find a respectable place to stay tonight, and then I would like you to stay entirely out of my sight." Gerald Hatch, to his credit and perhaps his shame, did not argue. He had the decency to call for his hired hand to take her to the hotel and to pay in advance for 3 nights. Whether guilt or simple relief drove him to this small generosity, Susan did not care. She walked out of his house with her back straight and her face composed, and did not let herself feel the full weight of her situation, until she was alone in a room, the size of a large closet with a window that looked out over the main street of Harwick. Then she sat on the edge of the narrow bed and pressed her hands flat against her thighs and breathed very carefully for a long time. She was in a town where she knew no one. She had enough money to last perhaps 2 weeks if she was careful. She had no return ticket because she had not imagined needing one. The nearest large city was Denver, and the eastbound train came through Harwick every Wednesday and Saturday. Today was Monday. She was in serious trouble, and she knew it. And she allowed herself exactly 10 minutes to feel the full terror of that before she stood up, washed her face in the basin, and began to think practically about what came next. The next morning she went to the hotel's small dining room for breakfast and listened carefully to every conversation around her, the way she had always listened when she needed to understand a new situation. She heard about a drought that had been troubling the ranches east of town. She heard about a dispute over water rights that had nearly come to blows at the town meeting 2 weeks prior. She heard the name Orville Abbott mentioned twice in connection with horses, and both times the person speaking used a tone of voice that suggested competence and reliability. She asked the woman who brought her coffee, a stout, good-natured woman named Hattie who appeared to run the hotel's dining operation with complete authority, who Orville Abbott was. "Best teamster in the county," Hattie said, topping off the coffee without being asked. "Drives freight and passengers both. Got a good eye for horses and a better one for trouble. Why do you ask?" "I need to get to the depot in Millfield," Susan said. Millfield was the larger town 18 miles east, where the main railroad line ran north to Denver. Harwick's depot received trains, but the schedules were irregular and the westbound line was prioritized. Getting to Millfield would give her significantly more options. "I was told the stage only runs on Thursdays." "That's right, but Orville runs to Millfield Tuesday mornings with the freight wagon. He takes passengers sometimes if they pay for the seat." Hattie set down the coffee pot and looked at Susan with the frank, assessing eyes of a woman who had seen many things come through her dining room. "You're the one Gerald Hatch sent for." It was not a question. Susan looked back at her steadily. "I was." "I will not be staying." Hattie made a sound that was not quite a word but communicated a great deal. "Smart woman. His kind has a smell about them." "You can find Orville at the livery stable before 7 if you want to catch him before he loads up." Susan thanked her, finished her breakfast with more appetite than she had expected, and went to the livery stable. She smelled it before she saw it: horses, hay, oil for leather, the warm animal smell of something large and alive being cared for. The stable doors were open, and the morning light came in at a low angle, falling across the hard-packed floor in golden bars. A man was working near the back, checking the harness on a big roan horse with the careful attention of someone who knew that small problems left unexamined became large ones. He was perhaps 28 or 29, with dark hair pushed back under a battered hat, and the build of someone who had spent years doing physical work without thinking much about the fact that it was making him strong. He was not tall in an imposing way, but he was solidly made, and there was a quality of stillness about his movements, the kind that does not come from laziness but from knowing exactly what each action requires and doing only that. He heard her come in and looked up, and Susan saw that he had dark eyes and an honest face, which was to say a face that did not immediately try to arrange itself into whatever expression it thought she wanted to see. "Mr. Abbott," she said. "Yes, ma'am." He straightened up from the harness but did not come toward her, which she appreciated. He let her come to him, which felt respectful rather than indifferent. "My name is Susan Wallace. I was told you drive freight to Millfield on Tuesday mornings." "I do. I need a seat. I can pay $2. He looked at her for a moment, not rudely, just taking in the situation with those steady dark eyes. He had clearly heard about her small towns being what they were, because there was a quality of recognition in his expression that was not familiarity. He knew who she was without knowing her. "I leave at 6:30, he said. $2 is fair. The wagon bench is not comfortable." "I grew up in Ohio," she said. "I am familiar with wagon benches." Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, but the territory adjacent to one. "6:30 then, Miss Wallace." "Thank you, Mr. Abbott." She turned to go, and then he said, "For what it is worth, and I don't know that it is worth much coming from a stranger, Hatch doesn't deserve the trouble he's caused you." She turned back. He was looking at her directly, and there was nothing prying in it, no appetite for drama or gossip. He simply seemed to want to say the thing and have it heard. "No," she agreed. "He doesn't." She walked back to the hotel and spent the rest of Monday organizing her thoughts and her trunk, and trying to decide what she was going to do with her life now that the plan she had made was destroyed. The morning was cold and purple dark when she arrived at the livery stable with her trunk. The mountains to the west were black shapes against a sky that had not yet decided what color to be. Orville Abbott was already there, the wagon loaded with crates and burlap sacks, the roan horse and a second, darker horse hitched and patient. He helped her up onto the bench without making it feel like she needed help, simply offering a hand when it was useful and stepping back when it was not. He loaded her trunk with an ease that suggested it weighed nothing to him, though she knew it was heavy, and then he climbed up beside her and took the reins, and they moved out of Harwick in the early gray light without ceremony. For the first mile or so neither of them spoke, and Susan found that she did not feel the need to fill the silence. The air smelled of sage and cold stone, and something sweetly indefinable that she would later understand was simply the smell of western Colorado in the early morning. The mountains were enormous. She had not understood from the train how enormous they were. The train had made them feel like scenery, like a painted backdrop. But from the wagon bench with nothing between her and them, they were almost frightening in their immensity. First time seeing them up close, Orville said. From this angle, yes, she paused. They are larger than I expected. Most things out here are, or smaller depending. He handled the reins lightly, barely seeming to touch them, and the horses moved with the easy confidence of animals being driven by someone they trusted. Where are you thinking of going? After Millfield. It was a practical question, not an intrusive one. She considered whether she wanted to answer it. Denver, perhaps. I have some bookkeeping experience. There must be work there. Denver's growing fast, probably work to be found. He was quiet for a moment. You have people back east. An aunt in Cincinnati. My parents are both gone. She said it matter-of-factly because it was a matter of fact and had been for 6 years. My aunt is kind, but her house is small and her husband smaller. I had thought that coming west was the answer. It might still be, he said, just not the way you planned it. She looked at him. The sky was lightening now, turning from gray to a pale rose gold along the eastern edge, and she could see his face more clearly, the thoughtful set of it, the way he watched the road with most of his attention while still carrying on the conversation with the rest. You've been here long? She asked. 7 years. Came from Missouri when I was 22. He shifted his grip on the reins. My father had a farm there. Good land, but not enough of it, and too many brothers to divide it between. I came west with $20 and a good horse and decided I'd find a way to be useful. And driving freight is the way you found, among others. I've worked cattle, cut timber, done some scouting for survey parties. Driving suits me because it keeps me moving without requiring me to wander. There's a difference. He glanced at her briefly, moving with purpose and wandering with none. She thought about that. Yes, she said, there is. The sun came fully up around them, and the landscape opened into something vast and golden and rust-colored, the road running east through hills covered in scrub oak and juniper, the mountains receding behind them. Susan felt the warmth of the sun on her face and breathed in the big air and thought that whatever else was true, whatever disasters awaited her at Millfield and beyond, the morning itself was beautiful and she was alive and had her wits about her, and those were not nothing. They stopped midway to rest the horses and eat from the biscuits and dried beef that Orville had wrapped in cloth and tucked under the bench. He had brought enough for 2 without comment, which she noticed but said nothing about. They stood in a small hollow where a stream ran clear over pale stones, and the horses drank, and the silence was the clean kind that has no anxiety in it. Mr. Abbott, she said, can I ask you something direct? You can. What do people in Harwick know about my situation? I would like to understand what is being said. He considered this with the seriousness it deserved rather than deflecting. They know Hatch sent for a bride. They know you arrived and left his house within the hour. Most people know about Clara in Boston. His housekeeper has a loose tongue, but nobody said anything because it wasn't their business and nobody much likes Hatch anyway. He paused. Hattie at the hotel thinks well of you for walking out the way you did. Good for Hattie, Susan said, and meant it. He smiled then, a real one, and it changed his face considerably, not softening it exactly, but opening it up the way a door opened a room. She's a good judge of character, better than most. She spoke well of you. Hattie speaks well of anyone who pays their bill on time and doesn't cause trouble in her dining room. He gathered up the cloth from the biscuits and tucked it back under the bench. Ready? Yes, she said, and climbed back up. They arrived in Millfield by noon. It was a considerably larger town than Harwick, 2 stories on most of the main street buildings, a proper hotel with a sign that had been painted rather than carved, a brick bank, a railroad depot with a telegraph window, and a schedule board. The bustle of it was familiar to Susan in a way that Harwick had not been, the sound and smell of a place with commerce and movement. Orville drew up in front of the freight office and helped her down, and then lifted her trunk from the wagon with the same easy economy of motion. She paid him the $2, and he took them and looked at her for a moment. "The eastbound train leaves at 3:15, he said. "The hotel 2 doors down from the depot is clean and charges fair rates if you need to wait." "Thank you." She held out her hand, the way she would to a business associate, and after a brief moment he shook it. His hand was very large around hers and very warm, and he let go cleanly. "You've been very kind, Mr. Abbott." "Safe travels, Miss Wallace," he said. She watched him drive the wagon around the corner toward the freight yard, and then she picked up her trunk and walked toward the depot. She bought her ticket to Denver. She had $29 left, which would cover the ticket and leave her enough for a few days in Denver while she found work. She was not comfortable, but she was not desperate, and she had handled uncomfortable situations before. She sat in the depot waiting room with her trunk beside her and a 3-hour wait ahead of her, and she tried to feel settled about the decision. Denver was the right choice. Denver had opportunities. Denver was forward-moving and practical. She sat with this for 45 minutes, and then she got up and went to the telegraph office and sent a wire to her aunt in Cincinnati explaining the situation in as few words as possible, which felt like the responsible thing to do. Then she went to the hotel 2 doors down and had a meal that was better than she expected: roast chicken with good gravy and fresh bread. And she sat at a table near the window and watched the main street of Millfield going about its afternoon business, and thought about Gerald Hatch with a feeling that was somewhere between anger and a kind of exhausted sorrow. Not for herself exactly, but for Clara in Boston, who had spent 14 years married to a man who thought the solution to an unhappy marriage was to travel 2,000 miles and acquire another one. She was about to get up and go back to the depot when the door to the dining room opened, and Orville Abbott came in. He stopped when he saw her, and there was a moment where something crossed his face that she could not entirely read: surprise, yes, and something else. "Miss Wallace," he said. "Mr. Abbott, I thought you would be headed back to Harwick. I have another delivery across town first." He held his hat in his hands. "I hope the meal is good. Mrs. Garrett runs a fine kitchen." "It is very good." She hesitated and then did something she did not entirely plan, which was to say, "Would you like to sit down?" "Unless you are pressed for time." He was clearly a little surprised by the invitation, but he sat down across from her with the ease of a man who did not make a performance out of accepting things. He ordered coffee and a plate of food, and they talked for an hour with the afternoon light shifting through the window and the sounds of Millfield moving around them. And Susan felt, for the first time since stepping off the train in Harwick, something that was not quite peace but was its near neighbor. He told her about the ranches east of Harwick and the drought that had been troubling them, about a dispute between 2 cattlemen that had been simmering for 2 years and showed no sign of resolving, about a family of settlers named Brennan who had lost their barn to lightning last spring, and how the town had come together to raise a new one in 4 days. He talked about these things not to impress her, but because she asked and he was answering, and there was a quality to the way he talked about the land and the people on it that told her he cared about both more than he said outright. She told him about Cincinnati, the river in summer, the market on Saturday mornings, the way her uncle's shop had smelled of coffee and wool and dried herbs. She told him about the bookkeeping work and how she had been good at it, had taken real satisfaction in the cleanness of balanced accounts and the logic of numbers that meant something. She told him about the decision to answer the advertisement and the letters with Gerald Hatch, and she found that she could talk about it with a dry humor that surprised even herself. 11 days on a train for this, she said, and Orville looked at her with those steady dark eyes. "Not only for this," he said quietly, and then seemed to catch himself and looked at his coffee cup. "Denver will be better." "Yes," she said. "I think it will." She went to the depot at 2:45 and waited on the platform and watched the horizon for the train. The afternoon had turned warm, and the light was the long, golden kind that made everything look both beautiful and a little sad. She had her ticket in her hand. At 3 o'clock, she was still standing on the platform, and Orville Abbott's freight wagon was parked at the hitching post across the street, and he was sitting on the wagon bench, not looking at her, giving her the dignity of making her own choice. She understood then that he had not gone back to Harwick, that he had, after some private deliberation she could not see, stayed in Millfield. And she understood, with the clarity that had always been her most reliable quality, that he had done this not because he expected anything of her, but simply because he had not wanted her to be alone on a train platform in an unfamiliar town. The train whistle sounded in the distance. Susan Wallace looked at her ticket. She looked at the road back west, at the mountains she could see distantly above the rooftops. She thought about Denver, which was practical and forward-moving and the right choice. She thought about Gerald Hatch and the ruin of a plan she had made carefully and still had wrong. She thought about 11 days on a train, and the life she had left behind, and the life that had been promised, and the life that was actually here in this moment on this platform. The train whistle sounded again, closer. She walked across the street. Orville looked up when he heard her footsteps in the gravel, and she saw the careful way he arranged his face to show nothing, not hope, not assumption, simply the respectful blankness of a man waiting to hear what she had decided. "I was thinking," she said, "that Denver will still be there in a month." He was very quiet for a moment. "That's true," he said, "and I was thinking that I am a good bookkeeper and that Harwick is a growing town and that there is probably someone in Harwick who needs accounts kept. Tom Purdy at the general store has been doing his own books and making a mess of it for 3 years, Orville said, and the bank handles accounts for 6 ranchers, and I know for a fact that their ledgers are behind. There," she said, "you see." He looked at her for another long moment, and there was something in his eyes that was careful and warm at the same time, like a fire someone is tending very deliberately because they know it matters. "I have room in the wagon," he said. She handed the ticket to a boy standing nearby and gave him a nickel to return it to the depot agent. And then she let Orville help her up onto the bench with her trunk settled back in the wagon, and they drove west out of Millfield in the long afternoon light with the mountains growing larger and more golden ahead of them. They did not talk much on the return journey. They did not need to. The silence was of the comfortable kind, the kind that 2 people can sit in without it demanding anything of them, and Susan watched the country move past and felt something settling in her chest that was not the peace she had been trying to manufacture all day, but was the real thing, quieter and less dramatic than she would have expected, simply the sensation of being in the right place. When they arrived back in Harwick in the early evening, with the sky going pink and orange behind the mountains in a way that seemed almost theatrical, Hattie was standing on the porch of the hotel and looked at Susan with an expression that was trying very hard not to be satisfied. "Room's still yours if you want it," Hattie said. "I'd like it for a month," Susan said. "I'll pay weekly if that suits you." "That suits me fine." Hattie looked between Susan and Orville with the considering expression of a woman filing information away. "You'll want supper. I've got beef stew on." Orville helped carry her trunk in and then took his wagon to the livery stable, and Susan sat in Hattie's dining room and ate beef stew that was very good and felt the day settling around her like something that had finally found its shape. Over the following days, she discovered that Harwick was a more interesting town than her first frightened hours in it had suggested. It had been settled in 1876, the year Colorado became a state, and was still finding its character, the optimism of new places mixed with the hard-edged practicality of people who had learned that the West kept none of its promises automatically. There were cattle ranchers and a few sheepmen who kept to themselves, because the cattle ranchers had opinions about sheep. There was a school teacher named Miss Perkins, who had come from Illinois and was quietly determined to bring a piano to the school by the following spring. There was a Mexican family named Vega who ran the best garden in the county, and whose daughter Maria had married one of the ranching families and navigated the resulting social complexity with a grace and quiet dignity that Susan found deeply admirable. There was a blacksmith named Lars who had come from Norway and spoke English with musical precision, choosing every word as though each one mattered. There was also, inevitably, the matter of Gerald Hatch. He came to the hotel on her second day in town and asked to speak with her, and she agreed to see him in Hattie's parlor because it was a public enough space that there could be no confusion about the nature of the meeting. He looked diminished in the daylight, which she supposed was just. He had brought her $12 in cash, which he said was toward her travel expenses, and he offered it with the sheepish humility of a man who knew that money could not undo what he had done but who hoped it might help. She took the money because she was in no position to refuse practical help, and she looked at him levelly and said, "What you did was wrong, Mr. Hatch, not just to me. To Clara, who has spent 14 years married to a man who was never truly present in the marriage, you should write to her." Gerald Hatch looked at the floor. "I don't know that she'd want to hear from me." "You don't know that she wouldn't," Susan said. "You owe her at least the attempt." She stood up, which ended the conversation. He left, and she watched him go from the window, and then she turned back to her own affairs. Tom Purdy at the general store was, as Orville had promised, in absolute disarray with his accounts. She introduced herself the following morning, laid out her qualifications plainly, and within 20 minutes had been hired to put his books in order at a rate of $1 per day. His ledgers were indeed a mess. 3 years of imprecise entry-keeping that had left him with no clear picture of what he owed or was owed. She set to work with the focus and quiet satisfaction she always found in the task of bringing order out of confusion, and by the end of the first week, she had reconstructed a coherent record of the past year and identified 2 suppliers who had been overcharging him for months. Tom Purdy was so delighted by this discovery that he told everyone he met, which meant that within 10 days the bank had approached her about keeping accounts for 3 of their ranching clients. And by the end of her second week in Harwick, she had more work than she had in Cincinnati and a clearer sense of her own value. She saw Orville Abbott almost every day, which was not surprising in a town the size of Harwick. He would pass the general store in the mornings with the wagon and lift his hat to her through the window. She would cross his path at the livery or the post office or Hattie's dining room, where they both ate most evenings because Hattie's cooking was genuinely excellent. They always found things to talk about: the drought, the town meeting about water rights that had finally produced a resolution, Miss Perkins' progress on the piano fund, the book that Susan had borrowed from the Harwick Lending Library, which turned out to be a novel set in Scotland that she found absorbing, and Orville, when she described it, said he had never been much of a novel reader, but that he had read the Bible cover to cover twice and found the Old Testament more interesting than people expected. "There are some remarkable stories in there," he said. They were sitting on the hotel porch in the evening, which had become a thing they did without particularly deciding to, both of them bringing their day's remaining energy to sit in the cooling air and talk for an hour before she went inside. Ruth, for instance, a woman who chooses loyalty over safety. "I know something about that," Susan said dryly. "I didn't mean it that way." "I know you didn't." She looked out at the main street, quiet now in the late evening, a few yellow lights in windows. "I admire Ruth. She made the hard choice, and it was the right one." She paused. "Though I think my situation is rather more comedic than hers." "Comedic," he repeated. "A woman who travels 2,000 miles to marry a man who is already married. If it weren't my life, I'd find it funny." He was quiet for a moment. "I don't find it funny," he said, and the simplicity of it, the complete absence of irony or lightness, made her look at him. He was looking at the street, his profile clean and serious in the lamplight from the hotel window. She thought about the way he had stayed in Millfield, the way he had sat across the street from the depot without demanding anything, the way he had held open the question of what she wanted to do and waited for her to answer it herself. Orville, she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name, and she felt it in a small way, the shift that it made. Why did you stay in Millfield? He was still for a moment. A moth bumped against the lamp above them and went away again. Down the street a dog barked twice and was quiet. Because I wanted to, he said, and because I hoped you might change your mind. About Denver, he looked at her then. About leaving. The directness of it startled her, though it shouldn't have, because she had been watching him be direct for 2 weeks, and it was one of the things she valued most about him. She looked back at him, and in the lamplight she could see everything in his face, that he was not trying to hide the care there, the quiet wanting, the steady patience of someone who was offering something real and was prepared to hear whatever the answer was. I changed my mind, she said quietly. I noticed, he said, and this time he did smile, the full one, the one that opened his face up. She did not quite smile back, but she felt it, the warmth of the moment, the rightness of it, like numbers that have finally balanced. She had always trusted numbers more than words, and what she felt sitting on this porch in the October evening in Harwick, Colorado, with this man looking at her with that careful, warm expression, was something she trusted the same way she trusted a balanced ledger, not because someone told her to, but because the evidence added up cleanly. I should go in, she said. Good night, Susan, he said. And again the name, the shift. Good night, Orville, she said, and went inside. The weeks that followed had a quality she had not experienced before, a kind of double quality, as though she were living 2 lives at once, the practical one, in which she went about building herself a working life in Harwick with methodical determination, and the other one which had no proper name but was the one that happened when Orville was near. The 2 lives were not in conflict. They were, she thought, unusually well suited to each other. He brought her small things. Not grand gestures. She would have been skeptical of grand gestures from anyone, and he seemed to know this intuitively. He brought her a good pen from the Millfield hardware store when he made a delivery run, because he had noticed her struggling with a pen that had a bad nib. He pointed out a particularly fine view of the mountains from the north end of Main Street one afternoon, because he happened to be walking that direction, and he thought she might like it. He remembered that she had mentioned preferring strong coffee, and made sure that, when they met at Hattie's for the morning meal, the coffee arrived at her cup before he looked anywhere else. She, in turn, did things that she thought of as practical, and that she realized were not entirely that. She listened carefully when he talked about the freight routes and the difficulty of the road conditions in bad weather, and the problem he was having with one of the wheel axles on his wagon, and she remembered all of it and asked follow-up questions. She found in the lending library a pamphlet on road conditions in mountain territories, and left it on his wagon bench one morning without comment. She made sure that, when she was putting Tom Purdy's accounts in order, she noted the fare rates for freight hauling so that she could tell Orville with confidence that he was not undercharging, because she had begun to suspect he might be. He was. He was charging rates that had been standard 3 years ago, and the market had moved. She told him this bluntly over supper one evening and laid out the numbers for him on a piece of paper, and he looked at the numbers and then looked at her with an expression she could not immediately categorize. You did this for me, he said. I did the arithmetic. It took 5 minutes. She pushed the paper across the table. You should adjust your rates by spring. Susan, he said. Yes. Thank you. She picked up her fork. It is basic arithmetic. That's not what I'm thanking you for, he said, and she understood him, and she did not argue the point. November came, and with it the first serious cold. The mountains collected snow on their upper faces, and the mornings in Harwick were sharp and blue-skied and beautiful in a way that cut right through her. She had never seen snow on mountains before, and she stood in the street one morning simply looking at it, the white peaks against the deep blue sky, and felt something enormous and wordless that she did not try to name. Orville found her there. He was leading the roan horse back from the water trough, and he stopped beside her and looked at what she was looking at. "First real snow on the peaks," he said. "It is extraordinary," she said. "Yes," he said, and she was not entirely sure he was looking at the mountains. There was a social event at the church hall in the middle of November, a harvest supper, which was a tradition in Harwick going back to the earliest settlers, when the whole town had needed to pool resources to get through winter. People brought food, and there was music from a fiddle player named Cole, who was missing 3 fingers on his left hand, but played with the remaining 2 and his right with a facility that was nothing short of miraculous. There was dancing. Orville came to her table halfway through the evening and held out his hand in the formal way, the way that acknowledged she had a choice. She took it. He was a good dancer in the way that he was good at everything physical, not showy, not technically perfect, but smooth and certain, leading with a quiet authority that made following him easy rather than something she had to think about. They danced 3 dances, and she was aware of the town watching, and she found that she did not care, which was new for her. She had always cared a great deal what people thought, had been raised to care, but standing in the circle of Orville's arm in the warm light of the church hall with the fiddle playing something that was half waltz and half something with no proper name, she found that the weight of other people's opinions had become negligible. Between the second and third dances, he brought her a cup of cider, and she drank it and looked at him over the rim and said, "You are a better dancer than I would have guessed." "You didn't guess, or you would have refused," he said. "True," she admitted. "I am being complimentary, Mr. Abbott. Try to receive it." "I'm trying, Miss Wallace." He took the cup from her and set it on a nearby table. "Shall we?" They danced the third dance, and when it ended he kept her hand in his for a moment longer than was required, and she let him. December arrived hard and fast. The first real winter storm came through before the middle of the month and dropped 2 feet of snow and closed the main road to Millfield for 3 days. Susan worked at the general store on those days, reorganizing the back inventory as well as keeping the books, because she needed to do something with her hands when the weather locked her inside. Hattie kept the hotel warm with a big iron stove and made excellent soup, and the snowed-in days had a quality of enforced coziness that Susan found, somewhat to her surprise, genuinely pleasant. Orville was snowed in too. He came by the hotel on the first afternoon, having gotten the horses settled and the wagon secured under shelter, and he sat in Hattie's parlor with Susan and a collection of other stranded people, and the conversation ranged from the drought to politics. There was a lively debate about the ongoing federal land policies that were affecting homesteaders across the territory, and Susan had opinions about this that she had not previously expressed in company but found herself expressing now. Because Orville was watching her with an expression that said he was interested in what she thought, and she discovered that she very much wanted him to know. "The land grant policies favor capital over settlement," she said, which silenced the room briefly. "The people who can least afford to lose their claims are the ones who lose them when the big cattle interests need more range. It is not complicated mathematics." Lars the blacksmith, who was among the stranded, said, "She is right," with the authority of a Norwegian who had watched this pattern from a distance and found it perfectly legible. Orville said nothing, but he was looking at her with something in his eyes that made her feel slightly warm in the face, and she picked up her book and pretended to read it. On the third snowed-in day, when the others had drifted off to various occupations and they were alone in the parlor, he said, "Can I ask you something?" "You can," she said, echoing his own answer back at him, and she saw him catch it and soften slightly. "Are you planning to stay in Harwick?" She set down her book. "I have been here 2 months and I have more work than I can comfortably manage, and Hattie has offered me a better room at a lower rate if I commit to a season. Yes, I am planning to stay." She paused. "Are you asking me something else?" He was looking at her very directly. "I'm getting there. Take your time," she said. He almost smiled. "I think about you a great deal," he said. "More than is probably appropriate given the length of our acquaintance. I think about you in the morning when I'm seeing to the horses and in the evening when I'm not at Hattie's table, and I find myself going out of my way to pass the general store at times when I know you'll be there. I'm telling you this because I think you deserve to know it and because I'd rather say it plainly than have you wonder." She looked at him for a long time. The stove crackled. Outside, the snow was still falling in a quiet, steady way. "I think about you too," she said. "Probably also more than is strictly appropriate given that I arrived in this town under circumstances that were somewhat embarrassing, and it has been only 2 months and I am still technically working out what my life is going to be." 2 months is not very long, he agreed. "No, but some things become clear quickly." He was watching her with that careful warmth, the fire tended deliberately. "What things?" "Whether a person is honest," she said. "Whether they are kind without needing to perform it. Whether they think of others before themselves without making a show of it." She held his gaze. "You are all of those things, Orville. You have been since the first morning I walked into the livery stable." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full, pressed solid with everything they were both not yet saying, and she felt it the way she felt a good accounting with the satisfaction of things that had been uncertain becoming settled. "I would like to court you properly," he said, "if you'll allow it." "I would allow it," she said, "though I will warn you that my idea of proper is probably different from your idea of proper." "How so?" "I intend to continue working. I intend to continue having opinions. I intend to say exactly what I think." "Susan," he said, "those are not warnings, those are reasons." She looked at him and felt the word land and said nothing for a moment because she was busy with the experience of being known as she was and finding it wholly acceptable. "Then we are in agreement," she said at last. The snow stopped the following day, and the road to Millfield opened and Harwick shook itself back into motion, but something had shifted in the town's understanding of two of its residents. Nobody said anything directly. Harwick was too practical for direct commentary about matters of the heart, but Hattie's expression at the breakfast table developed a settled quality, and Tom Purdy stopped asking Susan whether she was sure she was planning to stay, and Lars the blacksmith, when he saw them walking together on Main Street for the first time, simply nodded once with deep satisfaction, as though a piece of metalwork he had been watching come together had finally found its shape. Christmas came, and the town made what it could of it. Miss Perkins organized a program at the school that involved 12 children singing in varying degrees of tuneful harmony. The church held services. Hattie made a dinner that was, by common agreement, one of the finest meals anyone in Harwick could remember, involving a turkey that Tom Purdy had obtained from a ranch east of town, and a pie made from preserved summer plums that was so good it briefly silenced the entire dining room. Susan and Orville sat across from each other at Hattie's long table, with the rest of the town's assorted unattached residents and a few families who had come in from outlying ranches, and they talked and ate and listened to the conversation around them. And twice his knee bumped hers under the table and neither of them moved away, and she thought that this was, all things considered, the best Christmas she had had in a very long time. After dinner they walked together on Main Street in the cold clear night with the stars brilliant and enormous overhead, and she said, "In Cincinnati, Christmas smells like cinnamon and coal smoke." "What does it smell like here?" she breathed in. Pine, cold stone, something smokier than coal, the faint sweet trace of the plum pie still somehow in the air. "Like somewhere worth being," she said. He stopped walking and she stopped too, and he looked at her in the starlight with his hat in his hand and said, "I have something for you." He reached into his coat pocket and brought out a small package wrapped in brown paper. "It's not much. I didn't want to, it's just something I saw and thought of you." She unwrapped it carefully. It was a small notebook, bound in leather, with her initials stamped on the cover SW in clean gold letters. She ran her thumb across them. "The leather worker in Millfield does fine work," he said. "I thought for your accounts or for whatever you want it for." She looked up at him. The night was very quiet and very cold and very brilliant with stars, and she felt something in her chest that was so simple and so complete that she did not try to analyze it. "It's perfect," she said. "Thank you, Orville." He looked at her for a moment, and then, carefully, as though it were a question that deserved to be asked this way, he leaned forward and kissed her. It was brief and warm and tasted faintly of Hattie's plum pie, and she stood in it for a moment before he drew back. "Merry Christmas," he said quietly. "Merry Christmas," she said. They walked back along Main Street to the hotel, and she carried the little leather notebook home and set it on her bedside table where she could see it. And she lay in the dark for a while with the sound of the wind beginning to rise outside, and the knowledge of what was happening to her as bright and certain as those unreasonable Colorado stars. January was hard the way Western January was hard. The cold came down from the mountains like something with intention, and the roads were difficult, and the shorter days pressed in. But Harwick was a working town, and working towns did not stop for winter, and Susan found the work expanding rather than contracting as the cold kept people closer to town, and more in need of the services that a competent bookkeeper could provide. She took on 2 more accounts: the Brennan Ranch family, whose barn the town had raised in summer, and a new enterprise, a small freighting company that a man named Garrett was establishing to compete with the larger operations out of Denver. She helped Garrett draft his initial contracts, drawing on the legal language she had absorbed from years of working in her uncle's dry goods shop, where the contracts had been her responsibility to file and cross-reference. Orville came by the general store in the late afternoons when his work for the day was done, and sometimes he brought her something: a newspaper from Denver with a week's delay on it, a good apple from a store Tom Purdy had somehow acquired, once a small bunch of dried wildflowers that he said he had pressed in summer with the vague notion that they might be useful for something, and that she could decide what. She put them in a jar on the windowsill of the general store's back office where she worked, and Tom Purdy looked at them and looked at the door through which Orville had departed and said nothing, but made a pleased sound under his breath. One afternoon in January, Orville came in earlier than usual with the particular quality of controlled anxiety that she had learned to read in him, a slightly increased stillness, a precision about where he put his hands. "What is it?" she asked, not looking up from the ledger. "I need to talk to you about something." He sat down across from her work table. "There's a piece of land east of town, 30 acres, good water access, shelter from the north wind. It has a small house on it that needs work but is fundamentally sound. The man who owned it, Dawson, has decided to go back to Kansas and he wants to sell." She set down her pen and looked at him. "How much?" "He wants $400. The land is worth $600 at least, maybe more once the drought breaks, which it will. Water rights come with it." He was watching her carefully. "I have $280 saved. I could borrow the rest from the bank against the value of the land and pay it in 2 years with my freight income." "That is a good financial decision," she said. "The numbers work. I can do the exact calculation if you want." "I know the numbers work," he said. "That's not why I'm telling you." She looked at him steadily. "Then why are you telling me?" "Because I'm not interested in buying land for myself," he said, "and because I've been thinking about it since Christmas, and I've decided I'd rather say this plainly than work around it." He looked at her with the full, direct attention that was one of the things she trusted most about him. "I love you, Susan. I want to marry you if you'll have me, and I want to buy that land and build something on it that we build together. And I know it has only been 3 months, and if that is too soon for you to know your own mind, then I will wait however long you need. But I needed to say it because I cannot continue to. I cannot sit across from you in Hattie's dining room every evening and walk you home in the dark, and watch you light up when the numbers come right, and not say what it is." The quiet in the room was the kind that has weight. Sunlight came through the store's back window and lay in a warm stripe across the floor between them. 3 months, she said. 3 months, he agreed. "I know. I came to this town to marry a man I had never met on the basis of 11 months of letters," she said. "I think I know something about what 3 months of knowing a person looks like by comparison." He was very still. "Yes," she said. "Yes," he said. "Yes, Orville, I will marry you." She looked at him with the steady gray eyes that people sometimes found unsettling because they looked so directly at things. "I love you too. I have been managing it very carefully for approximately 6 weeks, but there it is." He let out a long breath, and then he laughed, not the controlled, quiet sounds he usually made, but a real laugh, full and startled and warm, and it made her smile in a way she could feel all the way through her. They bought the Dawson land on the 15th of February, 1884. The house was indeed in need of work. The roof had a soft spot above the kitchen, and two of the windows needed new glass, and the whole interior required cleaning, painting, and better thinking about furniture. But the bones of it were good, and the view from the front porch was extraordinary. The mountains visible from west to north in an arc that on clear days was so beautiful it seemed like something done to show off. The water situation was excellent. There was a creek running along the eastern boundary of the property that had run clear and strong through the worst of the drought, which Orville said meant it was fed by a deep source, probably snowmelt from a reliable aquifer. "You are the most practical romantic I have ever met," Susan told him, standing on the porch of their future house looking at the mountains. "I've been called worse," he said. "It is a compliment," she said. "I am also a practical romantic." "I know," he said, and put his arm around her, which was new, the easy physicality of it, the way it felt completely natural and not at all alarming. And she leaned into him slightly, and they stood there for a while watching the light move on the mountains and not needing to say anything about it. They were married in April, in the small white church that leaned toward the east. Miss Perkins played the organ. She had finally acquired one for the church, which was not quite the piano she wanted for the school but was progress. And Hattie cried shamelessly, and Tom Purdy stood up very straight in his good coat, and Lars the blacksmith sat in the third row with his broad Norwegian face arranged in an expression of complete approval. The ceremony was simple. The minister was a thoughtful man named Reverend Cole, no relation to the fiddle player, who had been in Harwick for 5 years, and who performed the service with a warmth that made it feel like a real event rather than a legal transaction. Susan wore the dress she had brought in her trunk, the good blue wool one she had thought she might wear for a different ceremony in a different life, and she thought briefly and without much bitterness about what she had imagined and what was actually here, and found the actual much better than the imagined. When Orville took her hand at the altar, he held it the way he did most things, with a steadiness and care that was all the more persuasive for being so natural. He said the words of the ceremony with the same direct quality that he brought to everything, as though there were no audience, as though the words were simply what he meant and he wanted her to hear them. She said her own words clearly and truly and felt them land in herself as she said them, felt the weight and the rightness of them. She had always trusted what she could measure, and this she could measure. Every conversation in Hattie's dining room, every evening on the porch, every small, honest thing he had offered, and every time he had waited for her to make her own choice, it added up to something she could stand on. They moved into the Dawson house, their house the following week, having spent a month of evenings and Sundays making it habitable. Orville had fixed the roof and replaced the windows and put a new floor down in the kitchen. Susan had painted the interior walls a warm cream color and made curtains from good fabric, and organized the kitchen with the same logical system she brought to Ledger's. Hattie gave them a quilt she had made herself, blue and white, folded in a way that suggested she had been making it for some time. The first night in the house they sat on the front porch in the April dark, which was still cold but full of the smell of the earth beginning to turn again after winter, and the stars were extraordinary, and somewhere in the direction of the creek something was making a sound that Orville said was frogs, which meant the water was good. "Frogs," she said. "Good sign," he said. "For the water." "For everything," he said. She looked at him in the dark. He was looking at the stars with the peaceful expression of a man who had arrived somewhere he intended to be. She thought about the train platform in Millfield, about standing there with the ticket in her hand and the train whistle getting closer. She thought about how the decision to walk across the street instead of boarding that train had been, in her whole life, one of the 2 or 3 most important things she had ever done. "Orville," she said. "Yes. I am glad I changed my mind in Millfield." He turned to look at her, and in the starlight she could see him fully, the honest face, the dark eyes with all the warmth in them he did not bother to conceal any more. "So am I," he said, "every single day." She moved closer to him on the porch bench, and he put his arm around her, and they sat in the spring dark and listened to the frogs and watched the stars wheel slowly overhead. And she felt the particular piece of a life that had found its proper direction. Not the direction she had planned, not the direction she had been promised, but the real one, earned and chosen and hers. Spring moved into summer, and the drought that had been troubling the eastern ranches finally broke in June, with 3 weeks of steady rain that turned the land green in a way that people who had been watching it dry up for 2 years found almost disorienting. The creek on their property ran high and clear, and Orville talked about putting in a small kitchen garden on the bank where the soil would be richest. And Susan agreed, and added that she wanted to put in a vegetable garden nearer the house as well, and that she had been looking at seed catalogs from Denver with some interest. The gardens were planted in June and grew with the enthusiasm of soil that had been waiting for water. Susan discovered that she had an aptitude for growing things that she had not known about before, having lived her whole life in cities and towns where gardens were other people's business. There was a satisfaction to it that was not so different from the satisfaction of bookkeeping, the sense of inputs producing predictable outputs, of order created out of raw material. Orville adjusted his freight rates in the spring, as she had recommended, and his income increased accordingly. He added a second wagon and hired a young man named Billy Cutler, 17 years old and eager, to drive it. Billy had come to Harwick with his family from Texas and was saving money to buy his own horse. Susan did the payroll accounting for the freighting operation and found it, if anything, more satisfying than the general store's books, because it was a growing enterprise and growing enterprises had an energy to them. In July, she went to Tom Purdy's store for thread and stayed to help him with an inventory dispute he was having with a supplier in Denver. And when she left, she realized she had been there 3 hours and had solved the problem with a letter she had drafted on his behalf that was, if she said so herself, persuasive and legally precise without being aggressive. Tom said she should have been a lawyer, and she said that in the current year no law school in Colorado would admit her, and Tom looked genuinely outraged on her behalf, which she appreciated. The town changed around them in the way that Western towns changed in those years, fast and unevenly, new people arriving, new buildings going up, old problems persisting alongside new ones. The water rights dispute flared up again in August, when one of the cattle ranchers diverted more than his legal share of the creek that fed several smaller properties. The resulting argument was conducted loudly in the street for 3 days before Reverend Cole managed to arrange a meeting in the church hall where Susan, who had been tracking the legal water agreements in her capacity as the rancher's own bookkeeper, was able to lay out the documented reality of who had rights to what with a clarity that left no room for argument. The larger rancher, a man named Calhoun, sat and listened to her with the expression of a man who is not accustomed to being corrected but who cannot find the error in the correction, and at the end of it he agreed to the terms that had been legally his all along. Driving home afterward, Orville said, "Calhoun has never lost an argument to a woman before." "He didn't lose this argument to a woman," she said. "He lost it to arithmetic. Some would say there's no difference. Those people can't do arithmetic," she said. He laughed, and the sound of it in the warm August evening was so easy and so good that she reached across the wagon bench and took his hand, which she had started doing without thinking about it, just reaching for him the way you reached for something that belonged in your hand. He brought her hand up and pressed it briefly to his lips without looking away from the road, and she felt the warmth of it travel up her arm and settle somewhere in her chest, and she thought that she would never be entirely used to this, the fact of being loved by this man, and she was glad. She did not want to be used to it. She wanted to feel it every time. September brought the first anniversary of her arrival in Harwick, though she and Orville calculated it differently. He counted from the day she had come into the livery stable, and she counted from the morning at the depot in Millfield, and both were correct depending on what you thought the beginning was. She was also, by September, quite certain that she was pregnant, and she told him on a Sunday morning on their front porch with the coffee cups between them and the mountains golden in the early light. He set down his cup and looked at her, and the expression on his face was something she had never seen there before, something enormous moving through the usual steadiness, something so full and unhidden that she felt it pull at her own chest. "Are you sure?" he said. "I am good at counting," she said. "I am quite sure." He got up from his chair and came to her and crouched down in front of her and took both her hands in his, which was not the most elegant posture but was precisely right. And he looked at her with everything showing in his face, every careful thing he had ever felt and managed and offered to her over the past year. "Susan," he said, and did not follow it with anything, because she thought that all he was trying to say was contained in the name, in the fact of her, in the fact of this, in the fact of them and this house and this morning and the child that was coming. "I know," she said. They wrote to her aunt in Cincinnati in October, and to his family in Missouri, and the letters came back warm and surprised and full of congratulations. Her aunt enclosed a pattern for an infant's gown, and a note in her careful handwriting that said she had always known Susan would find her way. The baby came in April of 1885, precisely a year after their wedding, a boy, which seemed to delight Orville beyond his capacity to express without becoming slightly incoherent, and which Susan found wholly charming. They named him James, after Orville's father, with Wallace as his middle name. James Abbott proved to be a demanding and vigorous infant who had his mother's gray eyes, and his father's dark hair and strong opinions about most things, which Susan found entirely appropriate given the source material. Hattie came and stayed for the first 2 weeks, managing Orville with the authority she applied to everything, directing him firmly away from hovering and toward usefulness, firewood, water, meals, and the specific management of Billy Cutler's delivery schedule, so that the freighting operation continued to function without its owner. Orville submitted to this management with the grace of a man who recognized good sense when he met it, and was visibly relieved to have something productive to do. Susan, lying in the bedroom with the baby in the crook of her arm, and the spring light coming through the window, and the mountains showing above the curtain, thought about the letter she had received that morning from her aunt, who had also mentioned in a postscript that she had heard from a mutual Cincinnati acquaintance that Gerald Hatch had written to his wife Clara in Boston, exactly as Susan had told him he should, and that Clara had written back. And that while the situation was entirely unclear and probably not resolvable, the correspondence was at least honest, which was more than it had been. She thought about Clara in Boston, the woman in the daguerreotype with the inscription to her beloved husband, and she felt something for her that was compassionate and complicated. A woman trapped in the ambiguity of a marriage that had become a ghost, neither fully alive nor fully dead. She hoped the letters helped. She hoped, if nothing else, that the honesty in them was some small salve. She looked at James, who was sleeping with the total commitment of infancy, his small face perfectly serious about the business of being asleep. She thought about all the ways a life could go wrong and then right, all the detours that turned out to be the actual road. She thought about standing on a train platform with a ticket in her hand. Orville came in quietly and sat in the chair beside the bed and looked at her and the baby with that expression he had worn since James arrived, enormous and unhidden and full. "He's still there," she said. "I checked," he said seriously. "I noticed." She shifted the baby slightly and looked at her husband. "You don't have to check every 15 minutes." "I'm aware of that," he said, and did not stop looking the way he was looking. She laughed, softly because of the sleeping baby, and felt the warmth of it in his answering smile and the sound of the creak from outside the window and the smell of spring through the curtains. And she thought that this was what it was, this specific, unremarkable, extraordinary moment. And she was exactly where she had chosen to be and exactly where she wanted to be. And those two things being the same thing was, she thought, about as close to perfect as life had on offer. Summer came back around, and James grew with the insistent speed of healthy children, becoming in rapid succession capable of sitting, standing with assistance, and moving with a low, determined crawl that required constant monitoring. The house, which had seemed adequate for two people, became richer and more complicated with three, full of small objects that needed to be kept off the floor and small sounds that needed to be identified as either significant or not. Orville managed this transition with the same competent steadiness he brought to everything. He was not a flustered man by nature, and fatherhood seemed to focus rather than disorganize him. He could work one-handed through a remarkable range of tasks with the baby propped against his chest, and James seemed to find the rhythm of his father's movements entirely satisfactory, often falling asleep to the particular rocking gait that came from Orville working at the wagon. The freighting business continued to grow. By the fall of 1885, Orville had 3 wagons running, and Billy Cutler had been promoted to junior partner, buying in with the horse he had been saving for, and the $300 he had managed to accumulate in his 2 years with the operation. Billy was a serious young man and capable, and Susan kept his accounts with the same thoroughness she brought to all of it, and felt the satisfaction of watching a thing grow that had been well-founded. Her own accounting practice had expanded to the point where she had more work than she could manage alone, and she began to think about what to do about this. The question resolved itself partially in November when Miss Perkins, who was a genuinely excellent teacher, but found the administrative side of the school increasingly burdensome, asked if Susan could take on the school's financial records. Susan agreed, and in the process of reviewing the school's budget discovered that there was more room for the piano than Miss Perkins had believed, and assisted her in drafting a proposal to the town council that was funded in February of 1886 to Miss Perkins' intense and tearful gratification. The piano arrived in March, hauled from Denver by Orville's wagon, in a journey that Orville described as one of the most nerve-wracking of his professional life, transporting something that could not be put back together if it went wrong. It arrived intact and was installed in the school with a ceremony that the entire town attended, and Miss Perkins played it with her eyes closed and her face transformed, and Susan stood at the back of the school with James on her hip listening to the music fill the room, and felt the particular pleasure of having been useful in the right direction. Spring came again, warmer than the previous 2, with the confidence of a land that had found its water. The garden behind their house had become something she was genuinely proud of, not prideful proud, just satisfied in the way she was satisfied by any system that was working well. The tomatoes were coming in and the beans were coming in, and there were flowers along the fence that she had planted because she wanted them, not because they were practical. She was pregnant again by May, which she discovered in the same way as before, by counting carefully and trusting the count. This time when she told Orville on the front porch with the coffee cups, he pulled her to him immediately. Not the careful crouching down of the first time, but the immediate instinctive gesture of someone for whom this person is simply the person they reach for. And she pressed her face against his shoulder and felt his arms around her, and heard him say something low and warm against her hair that she felt more than heard. "I heard that," she said. "Good," he said. They spent a quiet evening on the porch with James asleep in the house, and the mountains doing what the mountains did in the long Colorado evenings, turning colors in the sunset that no painter had ever fully captured, gold and rose and deep purple, and then the sudden swift transition to that dark blue that was somehow both the end of the day and the beginning of everything else. In August, a letter arrived from Cincinnati. It was from her aunt, who was 72 now and not well, and who said so plainly and without self-pity, because she was that kind of woman. She said that she had been thinking about Susan and was glad that things had worked out the way they had, and that she hoped Susan knew that the decisions she had made, all the decisions she had made, the brave ones and the practical ones and the ones that were both at once, were good decisions, and that her mother would have been proud. Susan read the letter at the kitchen table in the morning light and sat with it for a while. She wrote back that afternoon, a long letter, 4 pages, telling her aunt about the garden and James and the baby coming and the piano at the school and the view of the mountains from the front porch in the evenings, trying to convey the specific quality of this life so that her aunt could hold it somewhere and know it was real. She wrote that she thought about her mother sometimes when she was sitting on the porch in the evenings, and that she thought her mother would have liked Orville, because he was the kind of man who was easy to trust and who deserved the trust. She sealed the letter and gave it to Orville to take to the post office on his way into town, and he took it and read the address and looked at her with a question in his eyes. "My aunt is not well," she said. He nodded. "Is there anything I can do?" "No," she said, "just nothing, just this." She gestured vaguely at the kitchen, the house, the morning around them. "It's enough. It's what I'd want her to know about." He came across the kitchen and kissed her, briefly and warmly, and with the complete naturalness of someone who has been doing this long enough that it is part of the ordinary motion of a day. She pressed her palm against his chest for a moment, feeling the solid, reliable fact of him. "Go," she said. "You'll be late for the Millfield run." "I'm never late for the Millfield run," he said, "because you leave early enough to not be, which is different." She turned back to the stove. "Go," he went. The second child arrived in December of 1886, in the same bedroom with the same curtains that the spring light had come through when James was born, and was a girl red-faced and determined, and the moment she was not screaming, thoroughly pleased with the situation. They named her Clara, because Susan had thought about Clara in Boston across the months and years, and felt that giving the name forward was a small act of recognition, a way of honoring the invisible woman whose misfortune had, in its complicated way, put Susan on the road to this house and this life. Orville received this explanation seriously, and said he thought it was a fine reason for a name, and James, who was almost 2 and had significant opinions about most subjects, accepted the baby's presence with a cautious curiosity that over the following weeks evolved into a proprietary devotion that made both his parents smile. The winter of 1886 into 1887 was deep but manageable, the house warm and full, the freighting operation well enough established that the winter slowdown was expected and planned for rather than feared. Susan worked from home when the weather was severe, having established systems with her various accounts that allowed for the ledger books to come to her rather than the reverse, and she found she could do a considerable amount of work with a baby on her lap and a 2-year-old, investigating the contents of the kitchen cupboard. Spring found them in their house with 2 children and 3 wagons, and a garden that was already planned, and a list of improvements for the house that Orville had drawn up on the back of a freight invoice. In the practical way he managed most things. The mountains were still there, west and north, enormous and permanent and beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when they do not require anything of you but your willingness to look at them. Her aunt died in March of 1887. The letter came from the aunt's neighbor, a woman who had known Susan's family her whole life. She read it on the front porch in the cold morning, with the mountains still winter-white and James playing beside her, with a set of wooden blocks that Orville had made over the winter evenings, stacking them with the focused determination of someone who understood that the point was to build things. She did not cry immediately. She sat with the letter in her lap and watched her son build his tower and felt the grief quietly, without performance, the way she had always processed large things. Privately and completely, the way she balanced accounts, bringing every element into relation with every other element, until the thing as a whole was understood. Orville found her there an hour later when he came back from the barn. He took in the letter in her lap and her face and came and sat beside her without speaking and put his arm around her, and she leaned into him and said, "She was a good woman." "She must have been," he said. "She raised you right when your parents were gone. She did her best. Her house was small and her husband smaller, as I said." She folded the letter carefully. "She would have liked you. I told her so in a letter last fall." "I hope she knew you were happy," he said. "I told her that too. I was very thorough about it." She pressed the folded letter between her palms. She knew. He held her a little closer, and she let herself be held. And James's tower fell over behind them with a satisfying clatter, and he immediately began rebuilding it with perfect equanimity. And Clara made a sound from inside the house that indicated she was awake. And the mourning continued around the grief the way mournings always did, holding it without swallowing it, letting it be exactly what it was without requiring it to be something else. Summer 1887 brought good rain and good weather, and a prosperity to the eastern Colorado ranches that felt like the land catching its breath after the long, hard years. The freighting business was so active that Orville took on a fourth driver, a Mexican man named Esperanza who had come from New Mexico, and was the best handler of difficult roads that Billy Cutler had ever seen. Esperanza joined the operation with a quiet competence that made itself felt immediately, and Susan adjusted the payroll with genuine satisfaction, watching the numbers reflect the growth of something that had been built from $20 and a good horse, and the patience to do good work. She was working on the school's accounts one afternoon in the back room of the general store. She still kept an office there, because she liked the noise of the store around her, and because Tom Purdy occasionally needed immediate consultation about something, and it was easier for everyone. When the door opened, and a woman came in who Susan had never seen before. She was perhaps 50, dark-haired going to silver, well-dressed in an Eastern style that seemed incongruous in Harwick's general store. She had traveled some distance. It was in the dusty hems of her dress and the tired quality around her eyes, and she stood in the doorway of the back office looking at Susan with an expression that was layered with things Susan could not immediately read. "Are you Susan Wallace?" the woman said. "Susan Abbott now," she said carefully. "I was Wallace." The woman looked at her for a long moment. "I am Clara Hatch," she said, "from Boston." Susan set down her pen. She had thought about this possibility. She had thought about it in the way you think about things that seem unlikely but are not impossible, running through the scenario in her mind and determining what the right response would be. She had imagined various versions of this meeting, and most of them had been more fraught than the one she was in, because Clara Hatch, standing in the doorway of Tom Purdy's back office, did not look hostile. She looked exhausted and searching and somehow younger than Susan had expected, given the weight of what she was carrying. "Come in," Susan said. "Please sit down." Clara sat down across from her in the chair that Orville used when he came to discuss the freighting accounts, and she set her traveling bag on the floor and looked at her hands for a moment. "I know this is very strange," she said. "I know that I am likely the last person you expected to walk through that door." "Perhaps not the very last," Susan said, "but close." She folded her hands on the ledger. "How can I help you, Mrs. Hatch?" Clara looked up at her. "Gerald wrote to me," she said. "As you suggested to him, I believe. He wrote several times. We have been corresponding for 2 years." She paused. "I wanted to see this place. I wanted to understand the decision he made, and she stopped. "I also wanted to meet you." The woman who walked out of his parlor in 1 hour and then stayed in the town anyway and made something of herself. "He wrote about that too." "Gerald wrote about me?" "Not unkindly. He seemed genuinely ashamed, which surprised me." Clara looked at her carefully. "You told him to write to me." "It seemed like the least he could do," Susan said. "Yes." Clara was quiet for a moment. It has not resolved anything between us, the correspondence. I think some things cannot be resolved exactly, but we understand each other better than we did." She paused. "He is still in Harwick." "He is. He has a hardware business now. He stays largely to himself." Susan looked at her. "Are you planning to see him?" "I don't know," Clara said. "I needed to come here first. I suppose I needed to see that it was real, all of it, that it had really happened." She looked around the back office, the ledgers, the neat stacks of papers, the dried wildflowers still in their jar, slightly more faded now but still there. "You seem well," she said. "I am very well," Susan said. And then, because she was who she was, "Are you?" Clara looked at her with those tired, searching eyes, and after a moment something in her face softened into something less defended. "I think I will be," she said. "I think I came here to find out if I could be, and I think looking at what you made here, I think the answer is yes." Susan looked at her for a long moment. "Have you eaten?" she said. "Hattie runs the best kitchen in Harwick and it is past noon." Clara blinked. Yes, I could eat." "Good," Susan said, and closed her ledger and stood up. "Come on then, I'll introduce you around." She took Clara to Hattie's because Hattie could manage any situation, and because the best thing she could offer Clara Hatch was not sympathy exactly, but the sight of a life being lived forward, which was a thing she had become very good at. Over the following 3 days, Clara stayed at the hotel, and she did go and see Gerald Hatch. And what passed between them Susan did not know and did not ask. What she observed was that Clara returned from those visits with her face different each time, complicated. Yes, but not destroyed. The face of a woman working something out rather than being worked over by it. Whatever Gerald Hatch had done or failed to do, it seemed he was, in the end, attempting the honesty that was the minimum a person owed another person. On the 3rd day Clara came to find Susan at the house, and she stood on the porch and looked at the mountains and the garden and James and Clara Jr. playing in the yard with the intensity of 2 small people who had found something interesting in the dirt, and she looked at all of it with the expression of someone taking a careful inventory. "You're happy," she said. It was not a question. "Yes," Susan said. "Good," Clara said, simply and truly. "I'm glad it turned out this way for you." "And for you?" Susan asked. Clara was quiet for a moment, watching the mountains. "Gerald and I have agreed to divorce," she said. "The legal process will take some time. But we have agreed, which is the first honest agreement we have come to in 14 years. She paused. "I think I will stay in Boston. I have built a life there, modest but mine. I think I will go back to it and build it a little larger." "That sounds right," Susan said. "Your husband," Clara said. "He seems like a good man." "He is the best man I know," Susan said, and meant it without reservation. Clara left Harwick on the Saturday train. She and Susan shook hands on the platform, and there was something in the handshake that was more than courtesy, a recognition, a passing of something. Susan watched the train go and stood on the platform in the morning light and thought about all the ways people's lives intersected without intention, all the damage and the mending that happened sideways and slant, and she thought that she hoped Clara in Boston would find what she was going back to build. Orville came to stand beside her as the train disappeared. He had walked down from the freight yard when he saw her on the platform. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. She looked at him. "All right." He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and they walked back up the platform and onto the main street of Harwick, Colorado, in the fall of 1887, with the mountains behind them and the whole length of their lives ahead. The years that followed settled into the deep richness of a life that is both ordinary and extraordinary at once. The ordinary in the daily texture of work and meals and seasons, and the small, unceasing demands of children growing, and the extraordinary in the fact that every morning she woke beside this man in this house, and every morning the mountains were still there, and the creek was still running, and she was still, against all odds, and through the ruin of the plan she had made, in precisely the right place. James grew into a boy who was mathematical and curious, and who began helping his mother with simple accounts before he was 8, which delighted her beyond all proportion. Clara grew into a girl of fierce opinions and extraordinary physical courage, who could climb any fence on the property by the time she was 4, and who, at 5, informed the household that she was planning to drive the freight wagon when she was old enough, which Orville received with total seriousness and agreed was entirely possible if she worked at it. The freighting company became, by the early 1890s, one of the most reliable operations in the county, running 6 wagons and employing 8 people. Susan's accounting practice had become something more than a practice. It was a genuine enterprise, a small office on Main Street that she staffed part-time with a young woman named Dorothy who had come to Harwick from Wyoming and had a head for numbers and a willingness to be trained. She trained Dorothy thoroughly and paid her fairly and watched her become, over 2 years, genuinely excellent. Harwick itself grew and changed. The church straightened its lean slightly when a new foundation was laid in 1889. Tom Purdy retired and sold the general store to a young couple from Kansas who kept Susan on as their bookkeeper, and also took her advice about the back office reorganization with a gratifying humility. Miss Perkins finally got her piano for the school, and then a second piano, and organized a town band that performed at every occasion and was considerably better than it had any right to be. They had a third child in 1891, another boy who they named William, called Will from the beginning, who was from his earliest weeks a peaceable and deeply amiable person in a way that suggested he had looked around at the existing family situation and decided the best contribution he could make was to be easy. He was easy and warm, and given to sitting with his father in companionable silence while the work got done, which Orville found deeply congenial. On the evening of their 10th anniversary, April 1894, they sat on the front porch as they had always sat on the front porch, and the mountains were gold and rose in the sunset as they had always been, and Susan held her coffee cup and looked at everything, the garden, the creek, the mountains, her husband's profile, and said, "I want you to know something." "What's that?" he said. "I have been happy," she said. "I have been consistently, genuinely, unreservedly happy. I think you should know that." He turned and looked at her, and she saw all of it in his face, the 10 years, all that had been built and tended and survived, all the ordinary mornings and the extraordinary ones, all the things said and the things understood without saying. "Susan," he said. "Yes. The day you walked into my livery stable," he said, "was the best morning of my life. Every morning since then has been better." She looked at him and felt it completely and reached across and took his hand. The children were inside, creating some kind of noise that would require attention shortly. The creek ran clean in the last of the evening light. The mountains were enormous and indifferent and beautiful, the way they had always been, the way they would always be. She held his hand and they sat in it, all of it, and the stars came up one by one in the deep Colorado sky, and the night settled around the house and the garden and the creek and everything they had made, and it was whole, and it was theirs, and it was good.